Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Effective Practices in Peer Mentoring. We're really excited to have all of you with us today. This webinar will last about an hour, and we're going to be talking a lot about some great new peer mentoring kind of research synthesis and practices for programs, a new resource that we have come out with, and we're just really excited to have this conversation with all of you today. I am Mike Geringer, the Director of Research and Evaluation at Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. So welcome, everyone. I'm joined by my colleague, Nikki Patnod, who has a much more interesting photograph and background in hers than I do. But Nikki will be handling the Q&A portion of today's presentation. Just a reminder to everyone, a little housekeeping here. We are going to keep the phone lines muted for kind of just best presentation quality. But we will be taking questions from all of you in attendance today. So if you have questions about the content and the research and what we're presenting, please type them into the question panel. You can access that on the little control panel here for the webinar. Just type your questions in there. Nikki will be going through those, looking for good questions, especially if there are things that many folks are asking about. We will make sure we cover those. So don't be shy about asking follow-up questions. And all of the resources that we're going to be talking about today can be found on the Mentor website at the address you see here on the screen, mentoring.org/peer-mentoring. So everything that we're talking about today in terms of publications, you can find there. And just because folks always ask, we will be recording this session. We are recording it, and we'll be sharing that recording along with the slides and other materials in an email in the next day or so once we've wrapped up the event. So welcome, everyone. I would also like to introduce our distinguished panelists and presenters, and these folks were the co-authors with me on the resource we will be discussing today. So big welcome to Dr. Mike Karcher from the University of Texas at San Antonio, and then Janice Cooper-Smith and Rebecca Stelter, both from Innovation Research and Training. You may know their work at IRT from things like their training called Mentoring Central and a number of other awesome publications and things that they've done with Mentor and with others in our field over the years. So welcome to all of you. Quick agenda here as we get started, just so folks know what they can expect over the course of the hour. We are going to do some kind of just quick upfront framing of the project. The project being the creation of the wonderful resource you see in the image here on the slide, the supplement on peer mentoring for the elements of effective practice for mentoring. So we'll talk a little bit about what we put together, how we did it. We're going to talk quite a bit about the research that went into informing this publication and some of the main themes of that research that I think those of you that run programs or perhaps are funding programs might want to be thinking about in your work. Janice and Rebecca will dive a little bit deeper into reviewing some of the key practices that we really recommend in this resource. As I mentioned before, we'll pause at least once, if not twice, for Q&A, making sure that we've got kind of our finger on the pulse of what matters to you in this conversation. And then we'll just wrap up quickly at the end and talk about next steps for getting more information out to you. So I would be remiss if I didn't pause here and give a big shout out and a big thank you to all of our partners at the Taco Bell Foundation. Their sponsorship and collaboration and partnership on this project was instrumental to the whole thing, and they've been tremendous partners in this work, especially given the pandemic and all of the chaos that caused for not only us at Mentor, but for the whole field, all of our partners in this work. The foundation was really very gracious in terms of allowing us to keep doing this work, adjusting timelines, things of that nature. So they were just really wonderful partners in this work, and we give them a big thanks. I do want to turn things over real quick to Jennifer Bradbury, the director of the foundation here, to talk a little bit more about their interest in peer mentoring and some of the great work they do with young people. So Jennifer, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. I'm excited to be here. Hello, everyone. It's truly an honor to be here to support the release of this great and timely research. when we started this, I think we knew it would be timely no matter what the state of the world, but it seems more timely now because, obviously you all know this has been a challenging year for us, including the children and young people in our lives. So it's evident more than ever before that youth need support from their peers. I've seen it with my own children during quarantine. Being isolated from their peers and friends has been a challenge, and I realize how invaluable peer relationships are in their lives. I also know how true this is for young people, the young people we serve at the Taco Bell Foundation, which is why we are just really proud to support Mentors Peer Mentoring Supplement. So a little bit about our foundation. At the Taco Bell Foundation, we believe in the power of relationships and mentorship to positively change the lives of young people. Our signature program is called the Live Más Scholarship, and it's a unique passion-based scholarship program designed to support young people during their entire educational journey with both funds and scholarships, as well as experiences, resources, and a community to support them. And that's actually what led us to our partnership with Mentor, to further this vision that every young person has the supportive relationships they need to grow and develop into thriving, productive, and engaged adults. In 2019, we began our work with Mentor to develop a series of impactful personal development workshops for our Live Más Scholarship recipients across the country, which included networking events with LinkedIn. And this year, we're obviously proud to launch the Peer Mentoring Supplement to Mentor's Elements of Effective Practices for Mentoring. I want to really thank Mike and his team for the incredible work they've put into developing this supplement that will be helpful to all of those of you out there working in the K-12 space, as well as peer mentoring models focused on the transition into and the persistence in college. As we all know, again, facing some challenges we've never seen before. So thank you so much. I'm really excited for today's session. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Mike, to take us through the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. And I really do encourage folks to check out their scholarship and the great work they do. I have a good friend of mine who's a librarian at a high school here in Portland, and one of her students that she was mentoring last year got one of those scholarships, and it was truly a life-changing thing for that young person. So you all do fantastic work, and I encourage everyone to check it out and learn more about these awesome scholarships that are available to young people. So let's dive in and just do a quick review of the project here and kind of what we created. So the impetus for this really came from a couple of places. One is, Mentor has been doing these supplements to the Elements of Effective Practice for a couple of years now. And I think this is a project that Janice and Rebecca and I all felt was needed when we first wrote the 4th edition of the Elements of Effective Practice, because as much great information as there is in that resource, we realized that it did not speak perfectly well to every type of mentoring program that is out there. There was more to say for certain types of programs. And certainly peer mentoring programs, I think, are near the top of that list of programs that work a little bit differently and have some unique things about them that we needed to talk about. I think even within the field of peer mentoring, these programs come in all shapes and sizes. They're serving different ages of youth with different goals, and they're set in different locations. So even within peer mentoring, there's a tremendous amount of diversity. But I think when I look at the information that's available to practitioners, to funders, there is not a lot out there in terms of good program implementation guidance. There's a handful of webinars. I know our good folks up in Canada at the Alberta Mentoring Partnership have put together some really fantastic peer mentoring resources, but there's really not a ton of it out there compared to, I think, what you find for one-to-one or community-based mentoring models. So our goal here was to really produce something that talked about how to do this work, where you're asking a young person themselves to step into that mentoring role. Like, how does this need to look different, right? So we always pride ourselves on these supplements being research informed, but we also take some extra steps to make sure that they are kind of practitioner vetted, if you will. We want to make sure that the advice we're putting out there meets the needs of those that are doing the work on the ground. So that's a nice segue into thanking this group. We did have a working group of practitioners and other researchers and thought leaders in the peer mentoring space. You can see the organizations and names here on the chart or on the slide. We couldn't have done this work without them. Their insights, their expertise was valuable, and frankly, they pushed our thinking on a number of things where, you know, the research may have hinted at some practice, but this group would say, oh yeah, well, no, we tried that and it didn't work for this reason, or it did work, but you got to do it this way. So they were really instrumental in helping us get these recommendations for practice right. I also want to thank Janice and Shane, who was with Mentor at the time, but has since moved on to another opportunity. She was a real major asset to this project, not only managing this working group, but working with each of them to author these wonderful snapshots of the work of these organizations. So if you look at the final product, there are things representing all of these organizations showing what these practices look like in real world applications. So if you want to see some really cool examples of what this work looked like in action, I highly recommend looking at those. And Janison was a real thought leader on those as well. So what did we make? What did all of this wind up resulting in, right? Well, you see here the cover to the peer supplement to the elements. Now, there are a few iterations of this, so I want to make sure our audience knows what's available to them. So there is a full version of the publication. It's, I think, well over 100 pages, so chock full of good information, but that includes the full literature review that we did, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. It's got a section that covers kind of general program design considerations, the things that you'd want to have top of mind if you were perhaps making or refining one of these programs. We then offer a ton of recommendations within the framework of the elements of effective practice. So within recruitment, screening, training, et cetera, we offer specific recommendations for peer mentoring programs. There's also a series of essays at the end of it that kind of provide justification for those recommendations, more context, more nuanced understanding. And I think that's a lot of what Janice and Rebecca will be speaking to here towards the end of our presentation. And I just mentioned those snapshots of these practices in action with our working group members. So that's what's in the full publication. But there is also kind of a handy checklist version if you'd like to go through those recommendations and just check off, you know, how your program is doing in relation to those. Do we do it? Do we not do it? Do we sort of do that practice, but not really? There is a checklist version that you can go through. There's also a summary version. It was really just that checklist plus some of those program design considerations. So if you're looking for kind of a shorthand executive summary version, that summary might be the one that works best for you. So many ways to access the content here. So I think very quickly, I wanted to just review kind of the research. Like I said, this is always the starting point in this work. We want to make sure that we are honoring kind of what research tells us about how this work may work best or not. So we did a lot of reading, like a lot of reading. We did a full search of the literature. We were building off one that Mike Karcher did a few years ago on a review for our National Mentoring Resource Center project. We basically updated that with a fresh search of the main kind of research databases. Wound up with about 300 publications total that we looked at, but really ultimately narrowed that down to about 250 here, just shy of that met our inclusion criteria, right? So they had to be serving the ages that we were looking at here. And just so folks know, we did extend the age that we were looking at here, not just to K-12 kind of ages, but beyond. There's a lot of peer mentoring stuff happening on that transition to either higher ed or career. So we did look at peer mentoring programs that were doing college access work, but also on college campuses doing kind of persistence work, making sure that incoming freshmen were well oriented to campus life, had the resources and assets they needed to stick with it both through freshman year and beyond. So we did kind of extend this out a little bit more beyond kind of a perhaps more typical youth age range. As you can see here, most of these programs were working in K-12 school settings, but a significant chunk were in higher ed settings. Very few of them were online. I bet that number would look a lot different if we pulled these programs today. They're probably all meeting online, but as you can see here, these tended to be very school site driven, right? So these were either happening usually in schools or in higher ed institutions. If you're curious about kind of the breakdown of who was mentoring in these programs, 55 of them used college students as mentors, and I will note that almost all of them had those students mentoring other college students, usually, as I said, incoming freshmen. Sometimes it was in the summer before, so like in between high school and freshman year, just to make sure that, hey, you're really going to show up on campus, right? But you'll notice that then the bulk of them here were using either high schoolers, middle schoolers, or in some cases, even older elementary students serving younger elementary students. I would say the most common configuration we saw were certainly high school students or maybe older middle school students mentoring elementary students was probably the most common breakdown. And you'll notice on the right here, these programs tend to be very heavily academic focused, almost entirely academic focused. There were some that were around behavioral issues, but once again, a lot of those were like behavior in the classroom kind of issues. But there were a handful that looked at career things. There were a surprising number that were looking at health outcomes, and even some of those were based in the school. So there was a series of really good studies of a peer mentoring program trying to teach healthy eating habits, for example, to one's peers, but even those tended to be set in schools. And you'll notice lastly on the list, a lot of these programs were focused on social skills and positive peer interactions. Now, sometimes that was in service of fitting in at school so that you could theoretically get better grades or feel happier at school, but sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was just literally helping a young person come out of their shell a little bit, teaching some relationship skills that I think probably have a lifelong impact when we teach young people how to get along with each other better. So that's kind of the breakdown of what these programs focused on. And then just quickly to summarize kind of the benefits, and there's a really fairly lengthy section in the full product where Michael and I wrote about kind of if you look broadly at what young people get out of participating in these programs, lots of good evidence that these programs can improve school connectedness, engagement, feelings of social support, improved relationships, and all of that, like I said, tends to move towards retaining of students, right? So young people that feel welcomed and feel like they belong at school, they tend to persist in school a little bit. And there was quite a bit of emphasis in this group around mentoring for youth with disabilities, immigrant youth who are perhaps not only new to the school, but new to America in general, and other groups. I think there was a real effort to use this type of programming to create community for young people that may not be experiencing a feeling of community within an institution or within a setting. And I already mentioned before, several of these were very successful in improving youth health behaviors. I think what really makes this type of program special, though, is what you see on the right-hand side of the slide here. Mentors, the young people stepping into that mentoring role, also had major benefits from this. We saw studies showing shifts in identity and kind of young people identifying with the role of being a helper, of really becoming a leader and someone who views their role in their ecosystems as being someone that helps others. I think that's a tremendous gift to give a young person. We did also see, though, studies showing improvements in grades and broader academic achievement, connectedness to school, self-esteem, those types of things, and even engagement in community at a broader level outside of, say, school walls. I think what we also noted, and this is kind of interesting and not common in the mentoring literature, we saw a number of studies that talked about kind of institutional level outcomes, right? So things like improvements in school climate, improvements in peer culture. I know that there are great programs like the peer group connection folks, for example, that mentor the entire incoming class of ninth graders in a school in an effort to make sure that all of those students are welcome that know how to navigate the ups and downs and ins and outs of being a high school student. That can't possibly have no impact on school culture, right? If you're creating relationships across grades and setting a tone for how young people interact, of course that's going to trickle out into how that whole building functions. So we did see some good examples of that as well. So I'm going to turn things over to Mike Karcher here, because he was really instrumental in helping author this part of the resource. And we're going to talk a little bit here about kind of things that people should keep in mind as they're designing one of these programs. So even if you already have an up and running peer mentoring program, these kind of program design considerations are things that you may want to think about. They may be areas where you can improve your work, or certainly if you are just now thinking about starting a program, these are things that we felt really would be top of mind. So take it away, Mike.
Hi, Mike. Thank you very much. And I'm really excited to be able to participate today. And I want to thank the Taco Bell Foundation for supporting this. This was a really needed supplement. And I've been looking at and thinking about peer mentoring programs for 20 years. And I learned a ton through the process of reviewing the literature, but also bouncing the literature off folks who are running programs in the real world, and also working with Rebecca and Janice, who know the elements of effective practice inside and out, and they've applied them to many types of programs. So they're being able to leverage that lens to look at not just the peer mentoring in primary and secondary, but post-secondary, makes this really just an amazing contribution to the field. And there are things that I would have said even if we hadn't done this, but that I learned a lot more about. And one of the things that stands out about the peer mentoring is how quickly and how easily it can become focused on activities, particularly academic activities, if not explicitly made to be relationally focused. And some of the things that stood out from what really effective programs did was the way they carved out time for relationship development, and how they made explicit the value of cultivating relationships, both by giving the kids things to do that were just for fun and just for learning about each other and just reflecting on their relationship, separate from any particular goals or curricular activities. I was really struck by two things that I'll highlight on these slides. I've developed my own program a lot with Mike's help, documented it several years ago, and felt like it was a pretty comprehensive program. But not until I applied the standards did I realize how lacking we were, and it appears many peer programs were, in recruitment, and particularly recruitment, but also in screening of mentors and mentees. I was struck also that in the standards, there's really nothing, there isn't a standard around activities, which really surprised me. But when it turns out, when we focus on peers guiding their younger youth, we really need to be thinking about how we support their use of curriculum activities. And so we do find that under training especially is some information, and we saw some really great examples of programs that really focus on training and support extensively, like the Peer Group Connection provides, by having the mentoring as part of a class, they're able to provide a great deal of preparation, study of the activities they're going to do, and then processing afterwards. And that kind of structure is really helpful for teens. And then the increased amount of training that's needed is something that some programs really were quite clear about providing. The C Research Foundation has a summer online training that they do for peer mentors. It's really amazing. And so in terms of supporting matches, it was very clear that programs need, and strong programs have, a curricular focus. They have purposeful activities, but they also supplement that by opportunities to strengthen the relationship. And one of my takeaways has been that from hearing specifically about what programs do, the more structure and training you can provide in activities, actually, the more confident the mentors can feel in the delivering of whatever activities they're going to do, and the better able they are to be able to pay attention to the child and to develop the relationship. If they're on the fly and haven't got a lot of training on what to do, they can be preoccupied and feeling insecure about the activities, but and then really lose sight of the relationship. And another thing I'll mention again on the last slide that I'll discuss is I think the value of teaching the kids what I always call the need to drop the prop. If the activity is the prop, or the thing that holds them together is the tool they're using, knowing when to go into and explore the relationship or provide an empathic ear, or sort of stop and set aside the activity that's planned to be present and available and responsive, that's when the relationship can really strengthen. And somehow that's got to get trained and practiced and then reinforced. I'm gonna try the next slide, Mike. One of the things I was also really struck by is, and I knew about this, but to see so many programs focusing on it and thinking about it, the benefits for mentors, and specifically their leadership skills and communication skills. I think the Yes Institute, they have an explicit focus on training their mentors in social skills, but in leadership development. And remind me of Nancy Deutsch's Young Women's Leadership Program. The using peer mentoring strategically as a way to facilitate leadership development is unique to peer mentoring, and it really makes this a unique opportunity to study this and look at this. But everybody who runs these programs should really think about how they can use the peer mentoring to capitalize on evidence that these peer mentors, that these teens have leadership potential and a capacity for caring and empathic concern for their community. So I think when we think about recruiting mentors, which is the next thing we'll talk about, thinking about the benefits for these mentors and prioritizing those is important. On the last 2 points on this slide, what also struck me is I've always known that it's really great to enlist the mentors as leaders of the program and facilitating activities. So they have ownership in the program, and peers, teens like to, follow their teens. And it also frees up the adults who are running the programs to be on the ground floating around. But I was surprised to learn about and see examples of adults being used as volunteers, like in the Boy with the Ball program. They have an excellent approach to using college volunteers to come in, and they bring them in large numbers and train them to provide support to the matches as well. And they even look at those adult leaders and over time look for potential for leadership skills and interests, and then start to really facilitate and train their adult volunteers in leadership. And they do the same thing with the teens. In fact, the Boy with the Ball program, when I asked them about this, they said if they were to rename their program, it would probably be something around the lines of leadership, because they view their peer mentoring program as a leadership development program. Next slide, Mike. And then for me, this issue of selecting mentors and how we recruit them, on page 29 of the report, there's a nice summary of the reasons that selecting high achiever mentors is usually not a good idea. There's a variety of reasons why the kids you think would be the best mentors, the shining stars, tend to not be. And we got evidence from many of the folks who helped guide our practitioner feedback input. That committee had lots of examples where the shining stars would have scheduling conflicts. Things would come up in the spring they hadn't anticipated in the fall for their school-based program, meaning matches had to close. And then some of those shining stars have motivations to pad their vitas, or even just to spend more time socializing with their peers. So really understanding the nature of the kids. The point around trying to interview and focus on identifying and recruiting mentors who have histories or evidence of histories of commitment to their community and interest in supporting their community and work with young children, that tends to be one of the better predictors of folks being internally motivated and staying the course. The last one here on don't rely on incentives. There's a variety of incentives. One common incentive is to provide course credit, like for example in the fall, whether it's in college or in high school, to kids, and have as an assumption that those those mentoring relationships will go 1 year, even if the course is only 1 semester. And we found evidence that really wasn't the case, and often led to lower match duration programs. So I was really struck by the need for us to think about how we can recruit mentors who are diverse and who look like just your average kids, but who we can see evidence of their potential as leaders, as empathic carers, as community contributors, and try to recruit those folks who have evidence of promise in this, so that we can use the peer mentoring as an opportunity to solidify their identity and foster their development through this unique opportunity to serve. And then the last slide, Mike, that I would like to just talk about briefly is just the importance of ongoing training. The report describes Herrera's study of the high school BIGS program for Big Brother, Big Sister, one of the best studies out there on peer mentoring. And one of the things that they took away was the value of additional training. In fact, it was following that study that Carla and Kyoki Hansen and I created a website that's still available for folks to use to provide an extra hour of training for anybody who wants it. It's called developingmentors.com. And it does focus on helping the kids really appreciate the relationship focus and be aware of the need to be attentive and also responsive in planning for closure. That's developingmentors.com. It also starts off with a survey, and many programs use surveys of a variety of traits as screeners. And so I would suggest that people consider screening and developing an internal database for their programs about whether certain assessment tools around empathy or leadership or social interest actually are related to longer matches or stronger matches. But the need for additional training for these teens is critical. Training in relationship development, training on how to drop the prop, which I would put under this activity selection guidance. Many programs prescribe activities, which can be great. And if they're trained in them, the mentors can be very efficacious in that, which is great. But knowing when to step away from that and focus on the relationship is critical. So that extra training is really important, and the additional specifics of six extra hours of training, specifically in curriculum deployment and implementation, was, I think, one example of the specifics that people can use, and they can seek out funding from folks saying, the standards suggest we need to provide 6 hours, not 2 hours of pre-match training on how to do this for these teens. Can you help us do that? Because we know it's important. So there's just a wealth of specifics that I know are already strengthening my program and my understanding of what teens need to be effective.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. And just so folks know, I think Janice and Rebecca will be diving even deeper into some of the critical areas you mentioned here, right? Recruiting the right participants in the first place and providing that more robust training. I know they'll be getting into more specifics around that here in just a minute. I did want to pause here. I saw we had a couple of questions come in. And so Nikki, I want to pause here. Maybe we can do a question or two before we turn things over to Janice and Rebecca. Anything good bubble up in the question panel there?
Sure. One of the questions that came through was, what does peer mentoring look like given the new normal that we are all experiencing now, especially for those of us who are wishing to add something like peer mentoring to current programming?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about during this pandemic is what are the types of programs that are going to be most impacted by this. And in many ways, I feel like programs that function in groups, which peer mentoring efforts often do, and those that are site-based. I mean, you saw those statistics at the beginning of this in the research around how many of these programs were being held at a location, right? There are very kind of community-based peer mentoring relationships. So just closed down facilities in and of itself is a massive challenge. I think in thinking about, either adding peer mentoring support at this time as part of a pandemic related thing, or just thinking about how existing peer mentoring programs can do what they do virtually. I think it's a challenge, but I think, top of mind for me as someone with 2 kids about to go back to school in a few weeks, I think peer mentors can be really instrumental in helping younger students navigate the online educational experience. I know that at the end of the last school year, my district here in Portland, Oregon, there were like 15 different platforms that my kids had to log into and navigate, and some of them on video and some of it wasn't. And I really think that, older students could be instrumental in making sure that younger students know how to manage that, know how to show up well when classes are meeting virtually, keeping on top of homework. So I actually see quite a bit of potential right now for enlisting older students as, kind of academic coaches almost.
Mike,
I mean, they can't work on other things, but there is, I think, a lot of potential there.
so Mike, I've been
yeah,
really,
go ahead.
I was planning to roll out a peer mentoring program after school in a school this year, and then the pandemic shut that down and made everything virtual, and it became really apparent how difficult it was even to just transfer training as well as activities into a virtual environment. So that's a ton of work, but at the same time, schools are desperate for just what you're talking about, supporting kids, encouraging, using teams to help middle school and elementary school kids navigate as well as manage the frustrations around online learning. I've been really struck though that, peer mentoring programs are not peer counseling programs. And yet, even though I've said that for years, I'm aware right now that schools want to enlist teens in this way. And we may need to look to the peer support literature and the peer counseling literature in order to be sure we give training to the high school teens so that they don't get completely overwhelmed, so that they know when to refer and what topics and issues, because kids are really struggling out there. So our teens can really get overwhelmed. And I think even some of the trainings we have for peer mentoring, as we typically view it, are inadequate for the kind of peer counseling, peer support that schools are begging teens to provide right now. I just want to throw that caveat and that warning out there.
Yeah, appreciate that, Michael. Janice and Rebecca, any thoughts on that question? No. Okay.
No.
So I think
Okay. We have one other question. The other question is, how would you match the younger students with the older students if the peer mentoring program has not yet started?
Yeah, and I think we are going to talk about matching here in a minute, but Janice and Rebecca, do you want to give maybe a sneak preview on some of the matching strategies we saw work?
Hi, this is Rebecca. Sure. Yeah, I will talk about that in a moment, but considering their preferences is always a key criteria in matching. Thinking about the relationship history of the participants, the mentor and mentee, whether they already know one another, things of that nature are really important to consider in matching in cross-age peer groups. So I'll talk a little bit about that more in a moment.
Great, and I think that's a good segue into our next segment here. And I do want to turn things over to Janice and Rebecca to really dive a little bit deeper on some of the things that Michael and I have mentioned and specific practices that we thought were worth calling out here in our remaining time on this webinar today. And so Janice, take it away.
Yeah, thanks. It's really an honor to be with you all. And I have to say that this was a really exciting project for Rebecca and myself. As Mike mentioned, we've worked on all of the empirically derived versions of the elements, and then with Mike on most of the supplements. And I have to say, coming into this one, I sort of naively thought that there wouldn't be that much to recommend, and it would be a very short document and not a lot to say. I didn't really realize the scope of the literature, and I also this came on the heels of us finishing the supplement on group mentoring, and I thought that this would be very redundant with group mentoring. We would just keep referring back to that supplement, and boy, was I wrong. So this ended up being a giant endeavor with a huge literature, and as Michael said, it overlaps a lot with the peer counseling literature, and there's a lot to be learned from that work as well that I think informed a lot of our thinking about what would make effective peer mentors. So it was just like a giant, learning experience for me. And I have to say, I've been a big fan of Michael Karcher's research for a long time. So it's just was really a joy to work with him. And speaking for myself, I learned a lot in that process. So let me jump into, I'm going to talk about recruitment, screening, and training, and then Rebecca will finish up with the remaining standards. Let me say that for recruitment, we came up with 12 new recommendations. And for screening, we came up with 21. So that's a total of 33 really unique kind of concepts and ideas and recommendations for practice. So in the next couple of minutes, I'm not going to have the time to talk about all of them. So I'm going to just hit the highlights of a couple things. And then, feel free to, of course, read what we wrote in the justifications for the recommendations, and as well to reach out to myself or Rebecca if you have any questions. And I'm sure either Mike will give you our contact information, or you can find us on mentoringcentral.net. So one of the things that I think is somewhat unique for peer mentoring programs is that they're, as you saw in the lit review, the majority of them are hosted at a location or a site. And so there's a host agency that kind of welcomes in and provides the physical location and some of the resources for the program. And one of the things that was clearly emerged from the literature, mostly from the practice literature, is the ways in which programs fail is if the host agency, the host staff, do not know what's happening within their site or their building. So it's really, we wrote a whole section on the importance of recruiting a site or a setting to host the program, and the importance of really training and evaluating the commitment of and preparing the people who work at that site to welcome the program, the mentors, and the mentees. And we actually wrote quite a lot about that. We recommended there being a formal agreement, that there's a local coordinator at the site, and a bunch of other things. And then we always look at recruitment of mentors and the ways to recruit appropriate mentors. And in many programs where you're recruiting broadly from the community, that's really challenging. However, we didn't really notice that recruitment of peer mentors was quite as challenging as the recruitment of adult mentors, because they're often coming from a pool within a school of students who are either taking a course or volunteering, or they're earmarked by a guidance counselor or a teacher who believes that they could benefit from this experience and also make a contribution to it. So really the issue is recruiting the right people and creating the right messaging, in just like you would in marketing or advertising, to elicit the sort of the people to apply to be in a program who could, again, both contribute and benefit. One of the key things is that there are high premature closure rates in mentoring, and in peer mentoring in particular. And so one theme that we saw emerge throughout the literature is the importance of mentors making a commitment. And part of the understanding of that, and I think Mike spoke to it a little bit, is that a lot of students who do volunteer in high school are busy. They might be involved in sports, in theater, in academic clubs, or other kinds of things. They may be taking challenging courses. And so being clear with them that they have the time to commit, both in the immediate future and the long-term future. So, and that was one of the reasons for really thinking about recruitment of a diverse sample or diverse population of mentors. So, one of the things, a theme that we heard about, is that there was an initial enthusiasm and excitement about volunteering to be in this program and serving as a peer mentor, but that young people often don't look ahead and think, okay, well, this is what my schedule looks like in the fall. Maybe I'm not in any extracurricular activities or sports or whatever, but they're not thinking necessarily about the spring, and they might have different coursework, different demands, They might be applying to go to college. They might be applying for summer jobs, and they don't realize what the future may bring. So that's where that's all. These ideas are all wrapped up in the notion of commitment. And then the other thing we saw is that particularly for mentoring programs that are not located inside the middle school or high school that the students are attending, sometimes there's some barriers to their staying committed and staying involved and being predictable, like transportation or scheduling or coordinating with other things. So another theme that emerged is really trying to reduce the barriers to involvement. So the other thing is really crafting messages to appeal to, I had a hard time thinking about how to say this, but to appeal to volunteers who will have the attitudes that support being a successful mentor. And then screening individuals or screening young people for these attitudes. And here I'm kind of integrating both a recruitment and a screening recommendation or set of them. So actually, Michael Karcher's really contributed important work to the understanding of people, of the factors that are associated with mentors maybe not being as effective as you would want them to be. And one of those has to do with having positive attitudes about youth. And so there is a very nice brief measure that one can administer to kind of look at how positive prospective volunteers' attitudes are about their peers, about their younger peers, and whether that might make them an effective mentor. And there are other things that we recommend that you screen for, and there are measures available for each of those things. For example, comfort in dealing with challenging mentees and willingness to seek help, an openness to help seeking, and having a general interest in helping others. And then the other thing that we saw in the literature, and this was mentioned before, so I'll only mention this briefly, and that's that because commitment, long-term commitment, can be challenging for a young person who could be kind of myopic and only see the next few weeks in front of them, it's sort of important to include in your message what the benefits are to the mentor. So although they might be altruistic, there may be limits to their altruism. And I think that they're building their careers, they're building their portfolios, they're potentially interested in going to college or community college. And so mentoring is part of both having life experiences, giving back to their community, but also building skills and credentials for the next step in their, or steps in their lives. And then in terms of mentees, we talked about the importance and saw in the literature the importance of recruiting, screening, and enrolling a diverse set of mentees. And we framed this kind of carefully, but mentees who can fully participate as a peer mentee. So some people are not well suited to having a person who's close to them in age serve as their mentor. And so there has to be a sense that they will be able to be respectful, both in terms of respecting the boundaries and the role of the peer mentor, who again isn't that different from them in age. And so kind of assessing their attitudes about near age peers is really important. Okay, I know I covered a lot. So let me go on and talk about training. There are 43 recommendations in training, so it's gigantic. I'm only going to mention a couple of points here of the 43 that I think stood out for me. So one, which cuts across the entire field of mentoring, is that often mentors who quit prematurely do not have realistic expectations. And we think that that's, particularly challenging if you're going to mentor somebody who's near you in age, that you understand that you are going to be their friend, but you're not a peer friend. You're sort of a slightly older friend, which means that there's some boundaries you have to be aware of. So really explaining the roles of being a friend, a mentor friend, and what it means to be a role model for others is important in getting practice and understanding that and the boundaries of that. And really knowing that your role is supporting the health and safety of your mentee. Like the purpose of being in the program, you may benefit from it, but the purpose is helping that young person. And your efforts, your thoughts, your behaviors are around promoting that person's health and well-being. The other issue that arose mostly in our understanding coming from the practice field is that there can be a lot of challenges to confidentiality. So peer mentors might ride the same bus as their mentee. They might live in the same neighborhood. They may be friends with that mentee's older brother or sister. So understanding like what the boundaries are around that relationship and keeping things confidential. And then as Michael talked about, the importance of not just doing the activity, or you call drop the prop, but really training on how to spend time on developing a relationship and consequently learning those relationship development skills. And then if they're in a group setting where there are competing demands, like they might want to socialize and hang out with their friends who are other peer mentors, really having them understand and anticipate the challenges they may face in making their mentee a priority when they may want to go over and talk with a friend or hang out with a friend and not necessarily be in the mentoring role. So those are a few of the considerations. I'm going to turn over to Rebecca because I know we're getting short on time. But thank you.
Hi, thanks, Janice. I'm going to talk more about matching and starting mentoring relationships, and then talk a little bit about supporting cross-age peer matches and how that looks a little bit different than your traditional one-to-one mentoring. So to revisit that question about matching, some of the interesting characteristics or considerations when you are making these matches, one thing that came up was to think about the relationship history that may already exist between the mentors and mentees in your program. So that it could be a positive or it could be a negative history. You know, they may be friends already, may have, you know, their friends may be common, or they may have siblings that are friends. You know, particularly in smaller communities, they may be known to one another. So you want to make sure you gather information about those relationship histories, which you could get from both the mentors, the mentees, but also think about parents or teachers, other people in their lives who might inform, give you information about their history, and think about how you want to leverage that history, either to benefit the participants, or you may want to think about giving them new opportunities to meet other people, establish new relationships. Think about who will benefit from that relationship history or who may not benefit. And then also take into consideration the goal of the program. If the goal of the program is to help young people, the mentees, meet other peers to expand their social networks, then you probably don't want to match them with somebody that they already have a history with. And then also you don't want to match them with someone who, maybe they have had a negative relationship with in the past. Along those similar lines, you want to think about the behavioral history of the participants, whether they have a history of any kind of aggressive behavior. We know that children who are aggressive are at greater risk of being disliked or rejected by their peers, but that increased contact between aggressive children and non-aggressive children can promote positive behavior in both groups. So that's something to think about. You also don't want to be, if you're doing a site-based peer mentoring program, you don't want to be mixing too many groups of students who have a history of aggressive or risky behaviors with one another, and then also making sure that the mentors and the staff have the training that they need to manage any disruptive or aggressive behaviors that may come up. So those are some things about sort of the behaviors or relationship history to consider when matching. Shared interest is something that's always recommended when we're making matches in mentoring programs, and it's particularly important for peer mentoring relationships in which the younger mentors may be less experienced when it comes to coming up with conversations, initiating activities with a similar aged peer. having a common interest or several common interests can give them a starting point for things to talk about and things to do together. So again, thinking about the multiple common interests that they may have to sort of give them multiple opportunities to bond. Some mentoring programs like to use interest questionnaires, or you may have a brief interview that you do to gather information about interests that can inform matching. And then the last point I'll make about matching is to consider participant preferences. Some programs do this through meet and greet events with structured icebreaker activities so that everyone can kind of get to know one another a little bit, and then express their preferences at the end of that event for, you know, who they clicked with, who they enjoyed talking to. One program recommends that you not have everybody rank. This is the person that I liked the most, and this is the person I liked, you know, second most. But to just have participants say, here are the people that I enjoyed talking to, and say that you will consider that when making matches, but you can't guarantee that, you know, you'll be matched with your top choice. You know, just to make sure you're establishing realistic expectations and trying to reduce the likelihood that anyone will be disappointed. And just making sure that everyone knows who they are matched with before the first meeting is also really critical. Make sure that everyone has a chance to give some feedback on that. So next I'll talk about supporting matches over the course of the relationship. You know, there's, for site-based peer mentoring programs, they have, which seem to be very common in the literature, they have an advantage that they can actually, you know, typically sit there and watch the peer mentors and mentees meet with one another. And so they can give real-time feedback to the mentors if they're struggling with, you know, doing an activity with their mentee, or struggling with, you know, connecting and finding things to talk about. So that's definitely an advantage. But programs need sufficient staffing in order to be able to provide that level of observation and support. So making sure that you have enough staff during those in-person mentoring sessions to be able to help monitor the matches as well as potentially facilitate activities. Getting feedback from mentors, involving them in determining the activities of the program is mentioned a lot in the literature as something that can be really valuable for mentors. It helps them feel involved, they feel supported by the program, to know that they have a voice in sort of what activities are going to happen over the course of the year, and the activities they'll do one-on-one with their mentee. Recognizing their contributions can help sustain their interest and motivation to be involved in the program. And then the last thing I'll note is we have some recommendations around closure. Another unique aspect of peer mentoring programs, particularly ones that are based in a school or some other type of site-based program, is that the mentors and mentees may have contact with one another after the program has formally ended. They may still see one another at school or in an after-school program. And so closure is really critical here to make sure things end on a positive note, that everybody knows that the mentoring relationship has ended, officially ended, and that they have a conversation about sort of what their contact might look like after the program has formally ended. And you can see a lot more detail about all of these recommendations in the full supplement.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca. And yeah, just so folks know, if you've seen one of these supplements, we embed the recommendations right within the benchmarks and enhancements in the elements of effective practice. So we already offer a lot of specific advice on how to run a program, but you'll then find things that are specific to peer mentoring underneath those recommendations. So it's a really useful and I think easy way to kind of wrap your head around what's a little different about a peer mentoring program than perhaps more of a traditional adult-led one. So I know we're up against the top of the hour here, but I did want to squeeze in one last question. Nikki, if there's a burning idea or question in the question box, let's do one more before we wrap up.
Sure. There's just one last question in here, and I think you did a great job of answering it, but I did want to open it up to the to folks as well. Actually, The question is around matching in sort of a virtual space, because or in a hybrid space even. So because non-essential visitors might not be allowed into school spaces, how might matching activities or how might matching be handled in a virtual setting?
Mike, Janice, or Rebecca?
Any recommendations?
Hey, this is Rebecca. I mean, I think a lot's going to depend on the kind of platform that they are able to use to facilitate the mentoring relationships. I mean, in terms of I think the actual matching procedures may not be that different, although you may have to consider sort of the access to technology. On the part of the mentor and mentee, you may need to consider things that are like their schedule, some of those more logistical issues, but in terms of the criteria for matching that would just make that match successful, I think they'll probably be pretty consistent with what's recommended in the supplement. But yeah, it seems like there would be a lot of other logistical things that need to be taken into consideration in terms of how they'll actually get to connect with one another. And the e-mentoring supplement, you know, also has a lot of great suggestions for doing that online mentoring and what you need to think about in terms of training and supporting those relationships that are all online.
Great.
Thank you for plugging another supplement in there. Yes, for folks that don't know, we have one of these on doing an e-mentoring program, which came out literally right before COVID hit. Mike, did you want to jump in with a final thought there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, you know, the meet and greet approach could be one of the few things that's easily translated over to virtual in peer mentoring, where you could set up little chat breakouts and have groups of 8 to 10 mentors and 8 to 10 mentees kind of do a round robin speed dating sort of thing in little breakout rooms and meet each other, and then do the ranking at the end of who they wanted to, you know, learn more about and who they enjoyed talking with. I think that could actually be done for matching purposes via Google Meet or Google Chat or Zoom pretty easily. It's everything else that I think is pretty difficult to do online.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think the last thing I'll say on this question is I think we saw a lot of examples in the literature of programs that went out of their way to match young people who were pretty different from one another. And I think they did that as a means of expanding social circles and access to different types of people within your school, for example. But you know, I'm almost wondering if under these circumstances, given that we just talked about the need for these relationships to perhaps be more focused on emotional support and kind of helping young people with whatever this crisis has thrown at them, I'm wondering now if maybe in this time matching youth based on similarities so that I'm paired with somebody that maybe understands what my home life is like, or understands my culture, or understands kind of what I'm going through, my struggles. You know, there might be benefit in pairing up folks that have very similar backgrounds or life experiences here rather than kind of doing the mix and match approach. But I think the degree of intentionality you put into it is probably the key. You know, really putting some thought into what's going to work for your young people under these circumstances. So I know we're a little over time here, so I don't want to keep everyone much longer, but I do want to just thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you to our presenters and panelists and all of our guest speakers today. It's been a great conversation here. We'll send out the slides and a recording of the session here in the next day or so. I just have to get this uploaded to our YouTube channel at Mentor, and we'll send out a link. But all of this we talked about today is available for download at the web address you see here on the slide. I will also note that if you're looking for kind of other resources around how your program can meet the challenges of the pandemic, we have an excellent coronavirus resources page on the Mentor website. I encourage folks to check that out. And really just, you know, feel free to email us with your questions about peer mentoring or any of the things we've talked about today. I know all of my colleagues in this would be more than happy to kind of share our wisdom with you if you just reach out. So please do so. And on behalf of everyone at Mentor and everyone that worked on this project, Taco Bell Foundation and the rest, we're wishing you good health and good mentoring. So stay safe out there, and thank you for joining us today. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.